So even though Halo 3 is nearly 20 years old, there's still challenges that have not been pulled off to this day. One of the most simple challenges in all of Halo 3 is one of the most difficult. Get from one of these arches at the beginning of the arc to the other arch. As far as I know, no one's ever pulled it off. So can I? Let's give it a shot! So like I said, this challenge is really simple. I just have to get from one of these arches to the other arch. But you knew this was never going to be easy. So despite the fact that these arches are huge and the set piece for the entire mission theme, neither of these massive arches are really even in the playable map. In fact, I don't think the game developers ever expected anybody to ever get to these structures because they didn't even design the top of them. And even in the case that someone could hypothetically get outside of the map, Bungie decided to line the entire cliff face of this section of the mission with a mountain that is too steep to climb. Even if I were able to find a way to get outside of the map, I would still need to find a way to get to one of the top of these structures. In addition to this, I would then need to find a way to get from one structure to the other. So with all these variables working against me actively, how would I even start to attempt this challenge? Explosives. In order to break this map barrier at the beginning of the arc, we're going to have to do some MacGyvering because it's actually one of the most difficult map breaks in all of Halo 3. Okay, so I'm going to try to get out of the beginning of the arc, and this is one of the hardest map breaks in all of the game, I would say. I've never successfully done it, not once. 17 years of playing. So this is one of those rare videos where I have to figure out step by step how I'm actually going to pull this off, and I have to plan this pretty methodically. So I knew coming into this that my plan wasn't to actually execute this on the first try, I just needed to figure out the first step. And that first step was somehow getting outside of the map right at the beginning of the arc. Now in Halo 3, if you have a vehicle and you do it correctly in the right spot, you can pretty much break any map barrier. There are these things called elastic barriers that the geometry basically pinches your vehicle so tightly that once you get out of it, you are actually outside of the map with your character model. So that meant that I knew that my first step would be somehow getting a vehicle back to the first section of the mission. And what I found out was that if you hit a specific load zone where the prowlers come in on the arc, it will lock the door to the previous section and you can't go back. I reset this part a couple of times to see where exactly the load point was that I was activating with my character model. This way I would know exactly where not to proceed if I wanted to do this correctly. I found that this skinny tree with no leaves caressed in between these two rocks just before the ramp that you're supposed to take the mongoose over was the activation point for the load zone. But I also made another important discovery. I found out that if you hurry to the rocks just before you hit this load zone, some of the times you will actually activate a checkpoint. I knew that I would need to use this checkpoint later and it would be very crucial, but before I get to the checkpoint saga, which I promise you will be painful, I first need to figure out how to execute a successful map break. So after making this discovery about the load zone and the checkpoint just before it, I took a mongoose back to the beginning of the mission without activating that load zone that closes the door. I tried to line up the front of this mongoose perpendicular with this rock face so that I could shoot a brute shot behind it and launch it above it. But I found varying degrees of success while doing this. Sometimes I got it first try and it was really easy. Other times I would shoot the mongoose 6 times with the brute shot and none of them would go above the rock face. But one thing that's extremely important is that I need to make sure that I take this mongoose mostly intact to the beginning of the mission. In order to break out of the map, I was going to be using those explosives that I mentioned earlier, which meant that my mongoose at the bare minimum would need to have enough health to survive an explosion. And to pretty much guarantee this, you need to make sure that you have both the tilt and cowbell skulls activated. The tilt skull upgrades ranks of most enemies, and that includes vehicles as well. It basically makes vehicles super resistant to damage and grenade explosions. The Cowbell skull increases the force multiplier of explosions so that we have enough force to break through the map barrier. Anyways, now that we have this mongoose and we're in the beginning section of the mission with the vehicle, we need to proceed up the hill just at the base of the first arch. Now the steeper, more narrow path is not possible that I've found to actually traverse with the mongoose, so you need to take the left path that is closer to where you spawn in with the pelican. From here, we need to drive the mongoose just to the left of the barrier of the arch. We need to line this mongoose up mostly perpendicular to this wall, but angled slightly to the left where the geometry of the rock is flatter and will be able to stand if we can break the map successfully. I also need to make sure that my mongoose is in a position that I can actually get on top of it and make sure that I can rest in place. I'll need to actually get in this mongoose later. There's some weird physics around this area of the map. Basically, half of this hillside where I parked the mongoose is a slippery slope that you'll just slide right down. But now that I had my mongoose set up, I needed to go and get those explosives that I was talking about earlier. You might ask yourself, well, what explosives? Well, on the mission The Ark and on a couple other missions, there are these tiny little brute explosives that look like they almost have teeth. They might look small and insignificant, but they actually pack a pretty explosive punch. Now, I knew I would need exactly 3 of these explosives for the setup to get the mongoose and myself outside the map. And how did I know this? Well, a Halo tricker by the name of Crizel back in the day actually joined my Discord and let me in on that little secret. Now, there is a little trick to doing this. So remember the left path and the right path from earlier. I could not take the mongoose up the right path, but I could take it up the left path that was closer to the spawn where the pelican comes in. Well, this time with the explosives, it's the opposite. The path on the left is too steep for the explosives to be pushed up. But you can actually push the explosives up the path on the right even though it's steep as well. After successfully transporting 3 of these explosives from the first enemy area back to the first arch, I had just one thing left to do before I was ready to get this set up officially. I needed to push these explosives right next to the mongoose and have them in a roughly symmetrical formation. Once I had these explosives set up right next to the mongoose, I would get on top of this mongoose and have a second player kill the hunters later in the mission to trigger a checkpoint. From here, I would then throw a plasma grenade against the arch wall, get in the mongoose, and as this explosion was occurring, I would get out of my mongoose at hopefully rapid enough speeds that I would break the elastic barrier and then be out of the map myself. And after 25 minutes, I was finally ready to execute this. I just needed to jump on my mongoose and have my second player kill the 2 hunters later in the mission. Once I got the checkpoint, all I'd have to do is throw that plasma grenade behind the explosives, get into my mongoose, and then as this explosion is accelerating me into the elastic barrier, I'll get out and hopefully I will have broken the map barrier. Damn, kill myself every time. Did I break it? Oh, I just broke it. Yes, let's go. Okay, so I figured out the formula for it. It's actually not too tricky. Whoa, that's pretty cool. So after breaking the map barrier successfully, I did a little bit of exploring around this rocky face. And what I found was, I wasn't working with much. There aren't any objects in this area, and everything is too steep to get to any other area that's significant. So basically what you see here is what you get. In addition to that, I'd still have to find a way to get to the top of this arch. And then I'd have to find a way to get from that arch to the arch on the other side. But the problem is, I don't have any tools outside of the map. So I was going to have to come up with a plan. So to put this very simply, in order to pull this off, I'm going to have to do 3 separate things that are extremely difficult. 1, I have to get out of the map. 2, I have to somehow get to the top of the arch. And then 3, I have to launch to the other arch. All of these actions are very low percentage chances of completion. And this basically means that I am going to need multiple checkpoints in order to pull this off. In an ideal world, I would be able to get 3. But in my first session doing this, the only checkpoint I was actually able to get that mattered was killing the hunters. So I was going to have to figure out a solution to trick the game. Right after the first section of the enemies at the beginning of the arc, you're required to go through a cave with a bunch of light posts. Going through this cave activates a guaranteed checkpoint every single time. So my idea was to skip the normal cave load zone by setting up a box launch with 2 of the explosives you saw earlier, which I would then throw a grenade at so I could launch up and over the normal cave area around the rocks. Once again, shout out to Crizel because he showed me this technique that he used for a different trick entirely, and he let me know that I would need 2 explosives behind the crate in order to do this. Additionally, I would probably need a piece of equipment to jump off of in mid-air because the gap to get from the top of the rock that you're crossing to the playable area that you're supposed to be in is a pretty far gap. After setting up these 2 explosives directly against this Covenant space crate, I aligned my weapon's reticle with the wall with a frag grenade equipped. My plan was to throw a frag grenade at the wall, which would then make an explosion with the explosives, to which I would time my jump and get hit by the crate fast enough to cross this gap. Then, if I didn't have enough distance to make it, I could use a piece of equipment to jump off to cover the extra distance. So while you watch me fail at this box launch, I need to explain to you the mechanics and why exactly I'm doing this. So normally on this mission, if you have a player go all the way through the cave, you will activate a phantom that's scripted to come drop hunters off. Obviously, killing these 2 hunters is a guaranteed checkpoint. But if you kill all the enemies in this area before the hunters ever arrive, that is also a guaranteed checkpoint. But if you play the mission normally and go through the cave, the hunters are dropped off in the midst of all the other enemies, and in this scenario, you would only be able to get 1 singular checkpoint. Oh, 1 sec, this attempt's closed. So basically what I'm trying to do is get to this end area so that I can get a mongoose, come back, clear out the enemies in this area for my first checkpoint, then get out of the map like I did earlier, then kill the hunters for a second checkpoint to get to the arch. And if I was lucky, I might be able to get that 3rd checkpoint where the prowlers come in later. I would then use a deployable cover launch with that checkpoint to try and bridge the gap. But I can worry about that stuff later. I still needed to pull this off. Boom! Okay, I need to skip past all this shit. From here, I needed to get my mongoose, and I took this shortcut up this rocky path. Now, if you do this correctly, there's going to be a load zone right on this path once you get to the top that basically trips out the entire game. Once I hit this, all I needed to do was proceed to the mongoose section for my next step. Like earlier, I needed to launch this mongoose over this rocky ledge so I could take it to the beginning where I had the explosives set up and get out of the map. But this time, I was going to take a second mongoose to launch outside of the map before I launched myself outside of the map. Luckily, there are 2 mongooses in the prowler section of this mission. If I got one outside of the map, I could use it to launch up to the arch later. This was the solution that I was looking for and couldn't find. So after about 2 hours, I had my map break with my mongoose all set up. In addition, I had another mongoose just behind it ready to launch that outside of the map. So with 1 player, I proceeded to the checkpoint just before the prowler region. And then the unthinkable happened. For whatever reason, I got a random checkpoint when I was going back to this area. Now this in and of itself normally wouldn't be that big of a deal. In Halo 3, there's a mechanic where if every player in the game dies within 3 seconds of spawning 5 times in a row, you'll revert 1 previous checkpoint. But if I were to do that, my previous checkpoint didn't have any of my explosives set up, both of my mongooses were in their spawn spots by the prowler section, and this whole setup had already taken close to an hour and a half. At this point, I had to call it quits because the testing and the actual execution so far had taken 3 hours. But as I always say, tomorrow is a new day. I repressed the memories of the previous day, and after just 1 hour, I had everything in position and I was ready to get out of the map. Except this time, my steps were going to be a little bit different. With 1 singular checkpoint, I was going to break the map with a mongoose, and if successful, I would then try to hit the other mongoose outside of the map. I would need to complete both of these actions with just 1 singular checkpoint. Okay, I did make it out of the map. Each time that I broke the map barrier, I then took my second player and threw a grenade at the mongoose, and while it was in midair, I tried to boost it high enough and in the right direction of the cliff face just above. And I found that this was way more difficult than I thought it was going to be. And not so much because it was difficult to launch the mongoose on top of the cliff face, but rather because it took me over 10 minutes just to get 3 attempts in. But luckily, on my 3rd attempt, I actually got it. Did it. Okay. So at this point, I actually had a plan to do this with only 2 checkpoints. I wasn't able to get that Prowler checkpoint earlier, that free third one, so I only had 2 total to work with. I had to use one to get out of the map and get the mongoose outside of the map. So that would mean I only have 1 more checkpoint. And my original idea was to go to the corner where the map barrier meets the end of the arch structure and elevator jump with 2 people. Basically, if you stack one player on top of another player's head and have the bottom player walk forward into a corner, they can tap the A button rapidly and it will raise the top player and the bottom player until you stop mashing the jump button. But I discovered that the physics for players is different for vehicles. If you're not in a vehicle, you can just walk right to the other side behind the structure. But if you're in a mongoose, this wall is actually solid and you can't get to the other side. So basically what this means is I have one single opportunity to mongoose launch to the top of the arch and then separately deployable cover launch across to the other arch. This was far from ideal, but I was already here, so I decided to give it a shot. Okay, now I'm going back into the map to get a checkpoint. So I had my mongoose lined up in a good position and angle towards the arch. But now I needed to experiment with a combination of different grenades in different locations. I needed to get exact height in order to land this without dying to fall timer. In Halo 3, if you fall for 3 seconds, you die. So basically, I would need to figure out which grenade to throw as well as where to throw it in order to get the appropriate height so that I'm maximizing the amount of attempts. And after about 10 minutes of testing and fooling around with this, I finally found a solution that actually got me to the top of that arch. I bounced a frag grenade off the bumper of the mongoose while simultaneously shooting a brute shot, and this got me almost the exact height needed. Nice! Holy sh**, I'm actually here. So earlier I said I wasn't able to get that checkpoint in the Prowler region, but I wanted to make sure there wasn't a checkpoint to be had by killing all the enemies in the final section miraculously. See if I can get a checkpoint here. So I had the second player go and clear out this section, and I didn't get a checkpoint. So I really only had 1 shot to pull this off. Thinking just straight across. Which meant that if I wanted to do this, I would have to launch on top of the arch and then deployable cover across again. If you're unfamiliar with the physics of Halo 3, there's a piece of equipment called a deployable cover. If you look straight down at the ground, jump in the air, and then throw a deployable cover, your player model gets entangled with the shield of the deployable cover. These 2 textures colliding can eject you at mass speeds. Fuck. But it's one of the most precise launches in all of the game. Oh my gosh, this is going to be so difficult. No! Before this extremely close attempt, I was already at the 30-minute mark of trying this mongoose to deployable cover launch. And in 30 minutes, I'd only managed to do this 5 times. Now, I've done a lot of deployable cover launches in the past, and I know that the more difficult ones, especially with the longer range covered, can take thousands and thousands of attempts. At this rate, the Covenant would invade Earth before I completed this trick. I gotta find a different way to do this. So I decided to make the painful decision to reset my game entirely. Except this time, I wasn't going to use my second checkpoint for the mongoose launch to the top of the arch. I was going to use it for the deployable cover launch from one arch to the other. Which meant, with 1 checkpoint, I would need to launch 1 mongoose outside of the rocky cliff by the arch. Then I would need to break the map barrier, and then go to my mongoose and successfully launch to the top of the arch. There's try no way. Obviously, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, each of these things are low percentage chances of actually happening. So to string all 3 of them together was going to take a lot of attempts and time. Or if I got lucky, it wouldn't. At first, I attempted to do the mongoose launches wherever the mongoose happened to land outside of the map. But after a while of trying this, I didn't find much success. So I decided that I would take the extra time to orient the mongoose in a direction that was closer to what I had earlier. And I found it ended up being a waste of time. Come on. At this point, I had already invested 7 hours total to this trick over time. I was thinking about giving up, but in order to become a diamond, it takes pressure and time. I still wanted to reach for that diamond in the sky. For me, the goal was crystal clear.
Come on, dude.
And even though I was getting discouraged and losing the sparkle in my eye, you, I wanted to become the first person to ever pull this off. But in order to be the best, you have to be a cut above the rest. And you know what they say? God gives his hardest gems his toughest tests. You! Off. Come on, come on, come on, come on. Yes! Okay, so I'm going to go to the end of this structure here where I can actually see the bottom. So if you remember back to the beginning of the video, I mentioned that the developers didn't actually put a skin on top of these arches. So it's hard to deployable cover launch with no reference point. Additionally, there are slanted ledges at the end of these arches. In order to maximize the chances that I will live from a deployable cover launch at this distance this far away, I need to make sure that I am deployable cover launching upwards. Because my fall timer starts when I start going downwards, if I aim from the flat surface of the one arch to the flat surface of the other arch, needed without dying to fall timer. So I decided to set up my position for my second checkpoint at the end of this arch, angled towards the flat surface of the other arch. This setup right here. After 7.5 hours of total in-game time trying to get to this exact moment, I was finally ready to shine. Yeah. Come on, hit it, hit it, hit it! Oh, boom! I actually f***ing hit it! Hell yeah! That was a good one. That was a good feeling one. I'm gonna check this out real quick. Bam. Bam. Done it. The Arch Challenge. Okay, now I need to get to the bottom of this. Check it out, they gave you just the perfect path. You never actually get to see this wall. Looks pretty cool. Oh. Can't believe some of this is walkable. Like, this should not be walkable. A little bit scared of that. Oh, there's a death barrier right there. Found that the death barriers around here were a little bit strange. There was a definitive death barrier within the bounds of the normal map, but there's actually a lower ledge that you can drop down to, but it's a little bit too steep with one person to do without any help. Yeah, I avoided the death barrier. Oh. I used my second player as a spawn point in the map so that I was safe in exploring this area. Okay, you got to be very careful of these edges here. There's a death barrier right there. How do I know that? Well, hit it before. I love the fog. Fell. I'm gonna die. Yep. So basically on the bottom of this map, there's two different planes that are different levels, but you can only really explore an open strip at the bottom of the first map. Basically just a huge basin of sand and fog, so there wasn't a whole heck of a lot to see. So I spent another 45 minutes trying to hit the Arch Challenge again, just to prove that I could do it twice. Bang! There we go, we're back!